Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 331, Operation Barbarossa, Part 1. Last time, I interviewed David Chaffetz, author of the book Raiders, Rulers, and Traitors. Today, we start a series on the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany, known as Operation Barbarossa. My sources are pretty much the same as those used in the episode on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. First was On Stalin's Team by Sheila Fitzpatrick, Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar by Simon Sebag Montefiore, and Khrushchev Remembers. Additionally, I will utilize some of my numerous works on military campaigns. As I mentioned in episode 328, relations between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were deteriorating after the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Throughout 1940, the two powers were dealing with a number of issues that began to create a rift that they both knew would escalate into an all-out war. Hitler and his military aides had planned the invasion of the Soviet Union for 1941. Backing up a bit, we have to talk about the Soviet war with Finland before we can talk about Operation Barbarossa. The reason we need to do this is that the Soviet Red Army, led by Clement Voroshilov, was performing poorly against its much, much smaller neighbor. Based on the non-aggression pact the Soviets and Germans signed in 1939, Finland was to become a satellite state of the USSR. The Finns, for their part, weren't going to lay down and let Russia take over yet again, as they had during the reign of the Tsars. They would be invaded on November 30th, 1939, marking the beginning of what would be known as the Winter War. Despite an enormous advantage in the number of troops, the equipment edge, and air superiority, a war that Stalin thought would end in a day or so would take 3.5 months to conclude. As Khrushchev would be quoted as saying in his autobiography, quote, "All we had to do was raise our voice a little bit, and the Finns would obey. If that didn't work, we could fire one shot, and the Finns would put up their hands and surrender. Instead, they sent in their troops and made fools of the Russians." With Stalin furious with Voroshilov, the general snapped, according to another recollection from Khrushchev about Clement's response. Quote, "You have yourself to blame for all of this. You're the one who annihilated the old guard of the army. You had the best generals killed, and then smashing a platter laden with roast suckling pig on the table." You needed to be a brave person to say that to Stalin. The losses encountered by the Soviet army were staggering. They suffered close to 400,000 casualties, while the Finns lost 70,000. Khrushchev, in his autobiography, stated that there were over 1 million Soviet casualties, although this seems a bit of an exaggeration. The humiliation, though, was an even greater blow, which told Hitler that his soon-to-be opponent was in far worse shape militarily than he could have hoped for. This led the Nazi leader to make his famous prediction about an invasion of the Soviet Union. Quote, "We only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." The start of Operation Barbarossa was planned for May 1941. The Italians, though, were bogged down in their invasion of Greece, with Hitler ordering his military to support his ally, Mussolini. This would initiate the Balkan campaign. There was also a small problem brewing in Yugoslavia, an issue that would bring together a Slavic woman and a German soldier a year later, my mother and father. The invasion of Yugoslavia, also known as the April War, or Operation, began on April 6, 1941, following a coup d'etat against the pro-Axis government of the regent, Prince Paul, on March 27th. This infuriated Hitler, who ordered the invasion, which was put forward in Führer Directive No. 25. The attack began with a furious aerial bombardment of the capital, Belgrade. Land forces from the German army entered through Romania, accompanied by troops from Italy, Romania, Hungary, and the Ostmark, modern-day Austria. This overwhelming force resulted in the capitulation of the Yugoslav government on April 17th. Losses on the German side were extremely light. 151 were listed as killed, 392 as wounded, and 15 as missing in action. You would think, with such small losses in such a short time, that this invasion would have little to no effect on the timing of Operation Barbarossa. But this was not the case. It would push things back 38 days from May 15th to June 22nd. The ramifications of this delay will become clearer as we delve into the events of late 1941. The delay caused by the Balkan campaign has been debated by numerous historians. Some claim that the June start date was sufficiently early to allow the Germans to reach Moscow by September, avoiding the need to prepare for the Russian winter. Others cite the unusually wet winter, which caused extensive flooding during the spring thaw, as a greater reason for delaying operations. Others point out that some of the Axis allies, such as Finland and Romania, were not prepared as another reason. My father, who was stationed in Yugoslavia for a couple of years, particularly in Belgrade, was of the opinion that the invasion was a significant reason for the delay. Now, he should have known, as he was a communications officer for the Wehrmacht, the German army, and he was privy to the information flow from Berlin to Belgrade. As I've discussed in previous episodes, the Red Army had been devastated in the late 1930s by the order of Stalin. Of the 5 marshals of the Soviet army, only Kliment Voroshilov and Simeon Budyonny survived. On top of that, 15 of 16 army commanders, 50 of the 57 corps commanders, 154 of the 186 divisional commanders, and 401 of 456 colonels were killed, and many other officers were dismissed. In total, about 30,000 Red Army personnel were executed. Thousands more have been sent to the gulags throughout the Soviet Union. Many in the Soviet hierarchy begged Stalin to release the imprisoned leaders. Around 80% of those men were reinstated by 1941, but the physical and mental toll on them made many incapable of leading their troops when the war came about. In 1940, the Germans slowly began to place a growing number of troops into Poland under the guise of controlling their newly acquired territory. The truth was they were amassing there to eventually invade the USSR. When the Russians began to expand their rail lines in western Ukraine using their wide-gauge system, the Germans attempted to convince them to adopt the narrow-gauge European system. According to Khrushchev, this made him suspicious of the Germans, and he brought it to Stalin's attention. The boss grudgingly agreed that it was a bad sign, so he was quoted as saying, "Go ahead and give the order to convert the rest of the rails as quickly as possible." As Nikita would write in his autobiography, even though this did occur when the Germans invaded, they just simply tore up the tracks and converted them to a width that allowed them to use their trains to transport troops and equipment deeper into the Soviet Union. In May of 1940, the Nazi Wehrmacht invaded France with a speed and success that really surprised everyone, especially Stalin. He knew that Great Britain was up next, but he was likely to be a bit harder to beat in his mind. Stalin was very interested in the Battle of Britain, which was mainly being fought in the air. The longer it took, the better it was for the Soviet Union. However, the victory over France in such a rapid manner caused Hitler to become overly assured of his army's ability. It would cloud his judgment when it came to the invasion of the Soviet Union, as we shall see. In November 1940, Molotov made a trip to Berlin to discuss a potential joint operation with Germany aimed at defeating Britain. While Molotov was somewhat open to the idea, Stalin was firmly opposed to it. During the negotiations, they actually had to meet in an underground bunker as the British were bombing Berlin in a daring air raid. Molotov's hard-headed negotiations earned him Stalin's increased respect, well, at least for the time being. In July 1940, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the Germans were preparing to invade. The military hierarchy of the Red Army began to devise its own plans. They believed that the main thrust of the Wehrmacht would come north of the Pripyat marshes in Barbarossa. In contrast, Stalin believed that it would spread southward into the more economically prosperous area of Ukraine. Stalin would be proven wrong a year later. Because of this decision, the Red Army will be less prepared for the inevitable, causing a far greater loss of lives at the front had they been focused on the northern route. Even worse, both Stalin and Molotov were convinced that they had at least 2 more years before the Germans would invade, as they firmly believed that Hitler needed to deal with Great Britain first before opening another front facing the Soviet Union. Many believe that Hitler did not want a second front, but that he believed that Stalin was poised to attack Germany first. Nazi intelligence had seen the tremendous buildup of Soviet armaments and incorrectly thought that this was a signal of imminent attack. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Stalin was nowhere near having the capability and capacity to fight the Germans, as his army was still training new officers. Another issue that the Red Army had was Stalin's still raging paranoia. He believed that the army still posed a threat to his position even after the purges. To combat this concern, he established a rule that for every officer in charge of a division, a political commissar would be assigned nearby to monitor the situation. These men had equal or superior power over the division, which posed problems for the better trained officers, who themselves became increasingly paranoid. This made decision-making during the fighting impossible, and it would hamper any ability to make decisive moves. And this would become increasingly apparent during the first few months of the invasion. By August of 1940, British intelligence had passed on a date for the invasion of Stalin. They heard that June 20th, 1941 was when the Wehrmacht would cross the border and head towards their targets. The information came from intelligence based on ultra information obtained from the broken Enigma traffic. Now, the British couldn't inform Stalin about this, so the Soviet Union leader was highly skeptical, as he had no trust in the British. Führer Directive 21 was issued by Adolf Hitler on December 18, 1940, and it outlined the plan of attack against the USSR. Originally named Operation Otto, it was renamed Barbarossa in honor of medieval Emperor Friedrich I of the Holy Roman Empire. As a follow-up to Directive 21, the Barbarossa Decree was issued by Hitler on March 30th, 1941, which added to the directive by commanding that the war against the Soviet Union would be one of total annihilation, and sanctioned the extermination of all communist political leaders and intellectual elites in Eastern Europe. In this decree, the invasion was set for May 1941. The General Staff of the Wehrmacht, wanting to show their allegiance to Hitler, praised the plans. However, some within the higher echelon raised a number of red flags regarding the strategies and tactics. Hitler believed that his military was just unbeatable after the swift capitulation of the French army. It was a common thought at the time that the French were a formidable force, something we now know was quite overrated. Many in his inner circle were also concerned with the economic ramifications of an invasion and the inevitable occupation of a country as vast as the Soviet Union. Time and time again, They warned the Führer that Germany would be incapable of ruling over the vast expanses. The negativity was so great that he banned any further talk about this issue. They also warned him of the brutality of the Russian winter, citing the defeat of Charles XII of Sweden and Napoleon. Hitler was so convinced that the Red Army would be incapable of defeating or even slowing down the invasion that no plans were made to provide adequate clothing or supplies for his troops. And as we know, this was a major faux pas. To counter the pessimistic economic forecasts, Goering's Green Folder and the Hunger Plan were developed, which outlined an agenda that would starve the conquered population of the Soviet Union to death, thereby eliminating the need to feed them and saving money to offset the cost of a proposed occupation. With France and its neighboring countries subdued and the air war against Great Britain in full swing in 1940, the Germans began to amass their troops and supplies to the east. As in our last episode, David Chaffetz pointed out that Germany was a second or even third-class industrial power at the beginning of World War II. What they did have was a group of brilliant generals, unique battle plans, an impressive focus on building war materials, and, as Mr. Chaffetz pointed out, 1.5 million horses. Of course, to move the artillery, they used horses, which presented a significant logistical challenge. The upper echelon of the planners of Operation Barbarossa knew that it would take weeks or even months to move enough resources to the front lines before the battle could begin. Horses take a lot of care to allow them to move heavy items, as well as transport some of the hundreds of thousands of men necessary to invade a country as large as the Soviet Union. Now, many of you may have seen footage of tanks and trucks used by the Wehrmacht, but few of us have seen how vital and abundant the use of horses was in this war. This is why I was so overjoyed to have the opportunity to bring David Chaffetz on the show's last episode. Now, to fully grasp the enormity of the operation on the German side, we need to bring in a few numbers into the discussion. In June 1941, the Axis forces amassed approximately 3.8 million personnel, 3,500 tanks, 5,000 aircraft, 20,000 artillery pieces, 17,000 mortars, 600,000 horses, which is at the start, right at the front, and about 600,000 other assorted vehicles. On the Soviet side, they only had 2.9 million personnel, but 11,000 tanks and 8,500 aircraft. But the problem they faced was that many of the tanks and planes were older, and some were totally non-functional. You might have noticed that the Soviets had about 900,000 fewer troops available than the Axis forces. This is partly due to Stalin's belief that the Germans would be foolish to attack this early, as they were still engaged in battling the British in the West. Hitler believed that if he could defeat the Soviet Union as easily as he did other European countries, then Great Britain would sue for peace. Additionally, due to the purge of the military, which we know began in the mid-1930s, and had not ended when the invasion started, that 75% of the officers in the Red Army had been in their positions for only 1 year or less. Still, among the German military hierarchy, there were many misgivings about the ultimate success of the invasion. German generals Heinz Guderian, Gerhard Engel, Fyodor von Bock, and Franz Halder all believed that the only way to defeat the Soviets was to destroy Moscow. Hitler, on the other hand, was not really convinced. He thought Moscow was of, quote-unquote, no great importance, and he believed it was to be Leningrad first, the Donbass second, and Moscow third. Another opinion of his was that the Red Army's smashing defeat was the key to victory rather than territorial gains. Another problem on the German side was the astonishing lack of intelligence that would have given even Hitler pause to reconsider the invasion plans. The Soviet industrial power was vastly underestimated, as well as the number of soldiers they were amassing. While they only had less than 3 million men on the front lines, they had an additional 3 million in the second and third lines, both of which were undetected by the Germans until after they crossed the border and encountered those other troops. Additionally, Stalin had ordered a mass draft to raise more than 14 million new troops, although their training and readiness were hindered by their leader's belief that Hitler wouldn't invade when he did. Now, there's a lot of debate amongst historians about the suggestion that Stalin had planned to invade German territories in an attempt to spread communism throughout Europe. This began in the 1980s when former Soviet GPU agent and defector Viktor Suvorov posed the question in his book, Icebreaker. He proposed that Stalin had planned to attack German positions in 1941, but that does not seem likely as the Soviets were nowhere near ready to fight a war of that magnitude. According to the information I've gathered from numerous other authors, when writing about Red Army preparedness, quote, maintenance and readiness standards were very poor. Ammunition and radios were in short supply, and many armored units lacked the trucks for supplies. On June 21st, 1941, the German Wehrmacht divisions received notice that they would begin the invasion the following morning. This is 84 years ago. A German communist soldier, Alfred Liskow, had crossed the lines at 9 p.m. that day and informed the Soviets that an attack was coming at 4 a.m. They even tortured the man, not believing what he was saying. Stalin didn't want to believe this, and he was informed, but he thought it was a German propaganda ploy and dismissed the claim. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we will begin on June 22nd, 1941, when the German Wehrmacht would cross the Soviet border and start the largest invasion in human history, and that will allow us to wrap up this two-part series. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.